All right, well, good evening, everyone, and welcome to Politics and Prose. I'm Brad Graham, the co-owner of the bookstore, along with my wife, Lissa Muscatine, and we are very, very pleased to be hosting Haley Cohen Gilliland, who is here to talk about her new book, A Flower Traveled in My Blood, the incredible true story of the grandmothers who fought to find a stolen generation of children. Now, just out of curiosity, how many here have heard of Argentina's dirty war? Oh, great. Well, almost all of you. But for those who haven't, let me just say it was a systematic campaign of repression against political opponents launched by the military junta that seized power in Argentina in 1976. That coup followed a period of economic crisis and political violence, and in the name of restoring order, military leaders cracked down viciously, engaging in forced disappearances of thousands of people who were then tortured and in many cases murdered. Among those swept up in this systematic kidnapping were hundreds of pregnant women who then gave birth in captivity, and their children were appropriated and given to members of the military or police or their supporters. The parents, meanwhile, were killed and their bodies either buried or in some cases dropped in the Rio de la Plata, the wide, imposing river that runs by Buenos Aires. It was truly a gruesome period. But why, some may ask, decades after such atrocities occurred in a country far, far away from here, why should we now care? Well, for several reasons. First, the military's heinous actions then are a reminder of the depths that dictatorship can sink to. Second, in Argentina's case, a determined and ultimately influential resistance arose from an unlikely group, the mothers and grandmothers of those who were taken. And what they did stands as an inspiring story, an enduring example for the rest of the world. That's the story that Haley tells in her painstakingly researched and absorbing book. It's a triumphant saga of ordinary people doing extraordinary things in the face of pure malevolence. And there's another reason it has significance today, and that has to do with what happened once some of the grandchildren were found, and once Argentina itself was restored to democracy in 1983 and sought to come to terms with the horrors that had been perpetrated. The children themselves faced often wrenching choices when confronted with their original identities. And Argentina as a nation has had a difficult time wrestling with its history of violence and trauma and figuring out whether to punish or pardon the perpetrators and how to balance justice with peace. Now, Haley's own experience in Argentina dates back 14 years when, after college, she went there on a fellowship and subsequently was hired by The Economist to be the magazine's correspondent in Argentina and Uruguay. After 4 years in that position, she went on to other assignments for the magazine in London and in Los Angeles over the next 3 years. Since leaving The Economist, she's written feature articles for the New York Times, National Geographic, Bloomberg Businessweek, and Vanity Fair, among other publications. And for the past 3 years, she's served as director of the Yale Journalism Initiative, helping students pursue careers in journalism. She and her husband also started their own family, and it was the experience of becoming pregnant for the first time in 2020 that triggered Haley's renewed interest in the Argentine story of the stolen babies and the tenacious grandmothers who searched for them. And soon after that, she embarked on the book. Now, I met Haley through Yale, and she knew that back in my own reporting days for the Washington Post, I also had been a correspondent in Argentina, and that was in the 1980s. So she asked me to moderate, which I'm very honored to do. So please help me welcome out Haley Cohen Gilliland. Well, welcome, Haley.
Thank you so much, Fred. That was a really wonderful introduction.
Well, this is, truly a heart-wrenching story. I mean, I was telling you just a while ago when we were talking backstage, as it were, that, that it had been a while since I had really gone back and delved into it, and it was quite emotional reading about it all again in your really riveting, but also very. Sometimes difficult to follow book, difficult to follow in the sense that it's such a dark legacy for Argentina, but it's also a story of tremendous courage and perseverance on the part of the grandmothers, the Abuelas, the Plaza de Mayo, as they came to be called. So. Why don't we begin with you talking about what exactly, how the military junta at the time justified their repression, and how aware were the people of Argentina about what was actually going on?
Yeah. First of all, thank you so much for being here tonight. I'm so excited to chat with you, and thank you for having me in this incredible store. Yeah, so I guess to set the context, I want to step back a little bit, even beyond where I start the book, which is in the 1950s. Between 1930 and 1976, there were 6 military coups in Argentina, with the coup covered in this book being the 6th. And so the country constantly swung between military government and civilian government. And as you can imagine, this sowed a lot of economic chaos, social polarization, and it really hollowed out the democratic institutions in Argentina. And by 1975, the year preceding the coup, Argentina had basically devolved into bedlam. There were left-wing revolutionary groups that had sprung up and right-wing paramilitaries, and these groups were constantly clashing very violently. And so a bomb was going off in Argentina every 3 hours. A political assassination was happening every 5. And it was into this chaos that the military seized an opportunity to blaze into power in 1976, and under the guise of restoring order. But they had a much broader and more sinister plan, and that was to purge the country of, in their words, anyone whose ideas were contrary to Western and Christian civilization. And that meant certainly leftist revolutionaries, but also artists, journalists, poets, priests who ministered to the poor, in some cases nuns. So it was a very wide definition of what ideas were contrary to Western and Christian civilization. And it was as part of this purge that hundreds of pregnant women were also abducted and held in secret prisons until they gave birth, and then separated from their children and quietly killed, as Brad mentioned, sometimes thrown from airplanes so that there was no evidence of their murders. And their babies were placed with families that were deemed ideologically fit to raise them. So often families that were somehow related to the military and police. And all of this is incredibly dark, and certainly I don't shy away from the darkness of that legacy in the book, but the focus is really on the Abuelas de Plaza de Mayo, this incredible group of grandmothers that banded together at the height of the dictatorship, at immense risk to themselves, to find those stolen babies. And this is a story of how they worked together to do that. And what was the second part of the question?
Well, how aware was much of the country about what was really going on?
Yeah, so I guess to answer that question a little bit, how I structured the book. So the book is about the Abuelas as a movement and a group, and it's about the wider history of Argentina, but it's focused through the lens of one family's story, the Roisinblit family. And Rosa Roisinblit she's about to turn 106 next month. She's incredible. And she has always been a maverick. She is a first-generation Argentine. She was, her family were Eastern European Jews, and they escaped the pogroms at the turn of the 20th century and then became very successful ranchers in Argentina. And Rosa always had great ambitions and wanted to live in a big city. And so she took an opportunity to train to be an obstetrician when she was only 15, and eventually made it to Buenos Aires and got married and had her only child, a daughter named Patricia. And Rosa was born in 1919. So she had experienced all of those coups that I just talked about between 1930 and 1976. And she was aware of them, but they never touched her personally. And that was true of many people who were around in that period. They were aware of the political swings, but it didn't necessarily encroach on their lives. And so when the 1976 coup happened, many Argentines were under the illusion that it was just one more coup in the same vein and were not overly worried. And Rosa, for instance, was not immediately aware of the disappearances that were going on. Her daughter was involved in leftist activism, and so over time, her concern grew greater and greater. And then eventually in 1978, Patricia disappeared. And Rosa talks about how she really had very little clue that this was going on before her own daughter disappeared. She knew that there was some danger lurking, but there was so much silence in the country. There was so much terror. The press was completely silent, either out of fear or complicity. The church was completely silent. All of these institutions that normally stand up to shine a light on injustices were completely silent. And so there were large swaths of the country that had no idea that this was going on. And the military was an odd mix of brazen and secretive about what it was doing. So it would use unmarked cars and plainclothes officers to commit these abductions. But they would conduct these abductions in broad daylight and drag people from their homes and off the street. So they wanted plausible deniability. They didn't want people to be able to accuse them of what they were doing. But they wanted also to incite enough fear that they could keep everybody quiet.
So in the midst of all this fear and ignorance, in many cases, initially this tiny group of women started, they got this idea to begin to appear once a week in the central plaza of Argentina to call attention to the plight of their disappeared children. Now, Rosa was not a part of that group at the beginning, right? But she eventually became a part of that group, and it grew and grew. So talk about the early days of the Abuelas.
Right. So we just talked about how there was a huge amount of uncertainty and not a lot of knowledge about what was going on for most people. And when families were directly affected by this and their loved ones were seized from them, they had no idea what to do or where to go or how to begin to look for them. And so grieving family members, panicked family members looking for their loved ones who had been taken, immediately went to the only places they could think to search for information, which were often police stations, courthouses. So they were going directly to the government offices of the government that had taken their children. And they weren't initially necessarily aware of this, or they had a suspicion that that was the case, but they didn't know what else to do. And over time, the women in lines waiting at these places in these really depressing lines and getting no answers from the government because there were no arrest records, there were no jail records, there was no record of any of this happening anywhere, started to recognize each other and get very fed up at the way that they were being treated and the silence and the lack of information. And they determined, and I say women because it was mostly women waiting in these lines for a number of reasons. One, because they figured that they would be less threatening to the military. So young men were more likely to be targeted by the military. And also because Argentina in the 1970s was a traditional patriarchal society and the men had to continue working. And it fell on the women to do this type of desperate searching. So they began recognizing each other, and they got completely fed up of the lack of information, and they decided we need to demand answers. We need to go to the very center of Buenos Aires, which is, by extension, the very center of Argentina. It's the heart of the country. And that is the Plaza de Mayo, which is this very iconic square that stretches in front of the presidential palace. And they decided that they were going to go there every week at 3:30 p.m. on the dot on Thursdays to demand answers from the president and from the government. And that was really the first instance of anyone standing up publicly to decry what the government was doing. And those were that group of women eventually named themselves the mothers of the Plaza de Mayo, the madres. And the abuelas, the grandmothers, were mothers who eventually realized that in addition to looking for children who had been abducted, they shared this other plight, which was that their grandchildren had been taken as well, either as young children or babies, or their daughters and daughters-in-law had disappeared while pregnant, and they wondered if they might still be alive. So the Abuelas have their roots in this protest movement of mothers.
So the first time they appeared was April 1977. It was 13 months after the coup, and then when did Rosa join, and how long did it take the numbers to grow until they were a substantial number?
Yeah, so Rosa's daughter disappeared in October of 1978 when she was 8 months pregnant. And at the beginning, Rosa had not heard of the Madres or Abuelas de Plaza de Mayo, and so she conducted her own desperate search. And by the time Patricia was taken, her husband had died, and so she was a widow, and her family had begun to distance themselves from her because they knew about Patricia's activism, and they were scared of being associated with Rosa. So Rosa was completely alone, and she did the same thing that so many mothers before her had done, which was rush around to courthouses and jails and police stations in search of answers. And then eventually someone informed her of these groups that were working together, the mothers and the Abuelas de Plaza de Mayo. So Rosa joined in late 1978, and by that time, the Madres numbered in the hundreds, and the Abuelas numbered probably around 50.
And you could see them, you could tell who they were because they wore these white scarves on their heads. What prompted that?
Yeah, so actually now it's scarves because they continue to march every Thursday in the plaza because many disappearances have still not been resolved. And so this is a protest movement that continues today, and the Abuela search continues to today. Actually, the grandmothers found their 140th grandchild last week. So this is very current. It is a history, but it is an ongoing story and an ongoing mission.
I just want to add at this point, Haley's book, it's very detailed, but it covers not just the period of the Dirty War in the 70s and 80s. It extends over 50 years right up to current times.
Yeah. And so this is current history, but and they continue to wear white scarves on their head, but it actually originated as white cloth diapers. And the reason for that was that the Abuelas, the first large march that they participated in was a religious pilgrimage to a basilica that was about 40 miles outside of Buenos Aires. And they did this to draw attention to their cause. And they wanted to be recognizable both among their own group, but also to the outside world. And they debated various ways that they could recognize each other and ultimately settled on tying white cloth diapers over their heads, also as in honor of their disappeared children and to feel closer to them. And then over time, they decided to use scarves so that they wouldn't lose one of the only mementos, one of the only physical remains that they had of their children.
I mean, so how did the government react to this protest movement? I mean, there were a bunch of mostly older women demonstrating peacefully. I mean, but there was serious danger to some of them, right?
Absolutely. So at first, the madres and the abuelas were really dismissed. People called them las locas, which means the crazy women. And for the most part, they did not attract a lot of attention from the government. But the longer they marched and the more they showed up in the Plaza de Mayo each week, the government grew nervous and they started to attract attention, especially from international journalists. While Argentine journalists were too terrified to cover their stories, international journalists started to catch wind of what was going on and covering their plight. And the government at that point began to feel threatened, and only a few months after the mothers of the Plaza de Mayo formed, and very soon after the Abuelas formed, 3 mothers were actually disappeared. 2 of them were seized from a church, another was seized from outside of her home the following day, and their bodies were only found decades later.
Where were they found?
They were found, they had been thrown, they had suffered death flights, so they were thrown into the river, and their remains were found buried in an unmarked grave because they had washed up on a shore.
You describe at one point what these death flights were like, and I think it's important just to convey how horrific all this was, that maybe we take a minute and have you describe here just what the procedure was.
Yeah, so the military did not only want to purge people. Again, they didn't want any evidence of the fact that they were doing this, and so they did not want bodies. And so their preferred method of exterminating people was sedating them, loading them into planes, stripping them naked, and then flying up above the river, the Rio de la Plata, that runs alongside Buenos Aires, or a little bit further out to the ocean, and pushing these groups of people out into the ocean and to the river so that the currents would just take their bodies away.
While they were drugged.
While they were drugged. And I lived in Argentina for 4 years. Then I worked on this book for an additional 4.5, and it's still hard for me to wrap my head around. And it was in this context that the Abuelas resisted, and that was what they were up against, which makes it all the more amazing.
We should probably talk for a moment also about Operation Condor, because while this was going on in Argentina, there were other juntas, military regimes in South America, and at least 7 other countries that were part of this network of repression. There was coordination, in fact, between them under something called Operation Condor. What was that?
Operation Condor, as you mentioned, was a transnational network of dictatorships, of which Argentina was a part, Chile was a part, Brazil was a part, and several other countries. And they not only shared intelligence, but actually worked together on operations, on targeting people that they deemed subversive. And so in some cases, you had situations where the Uruguayan dictatorship and the Argentine dictatorship, or the Chilean dictatorship and the Argentine dictatorship, worked together to disappear people and then steal the children of the couples that they disappeared. And so an Argentine child might end up in a completely different country, and that made the Abuelas' work all the more difficult. But Operation Condor happened in the context of the Cold War, and so for many years, it had the tacit support of the United States as well. So that's sort of the relevance to.
Well, how much did the United States know about what was going on in Argentina?
So I was very lucky. Shortly before I began reporting this book, so after I lived there and worked there, but before I started working on this book, the United States government released huge troves of documents and declassified those documents, and those were extremely revealing about how much the U.S. government knew. And there is a cable that is probably the most damning that recounts a conversation that happened between Henry Kissinger and a high-up military official in Argentina. And you hear Kissinger saying something, it's not a direct quote because I don't remember the exact quote, but something along the lines of, if there are things that need to be done, do them quickly. And the Argentine military took this as a green light to carry on with the disappearances that it was doing. But there's a lot of evidence that the U.S. government was aware of what was happening in Argentina and elsewhere.
So let's talk for a bit just about the process of searching and trying to identify the remains. Today in such investigations, when they occur, we're very accustomed to hearing about DNA matches. But back then, this DNA technology didn't really exist yet. And so what kind of technology was available? What sorts of tactics did the Abuelas use in their search for their children and grandchildren?
Yeah, so the Abuelas, as I mentioned, some of the Abuelas had met their grandchildren. Their grandchildren were taken from them when they were babies or toddlers. And so in those cases, those grandmothers sometimes had pictures of their grandchildren. They knew their names, they knew their eye colors, they knew if they had identifying birthmarks. But in the majority of cases, that was not true. Many of the grandmothers, their daughters and daughters-in-law had disappeared while pregnant, and they were looking for babies that were complete shadows to them. They didn't know their sex. They didn't know anything about them. And the Abuelas are extremely prescient, and even though very few of them had backgrounds in science, they recognized from very early on in their experience working together that they were going to need to find some sort of tool to identify and reclaim their grandchildren that transcended the subjective. A grainy photograph was not going to work in most cases, and once again, many of these grandmothers didn't have photographs to work with. And so they realized they were going to need to find a tool that would be convincing to courts and that would allow them to connect themselves to their grandchildren. And they suspected that science would provide them that tool. And so they scrapped together money however they could. They pooled their husbands' pensions, they sought donations, and they started traveling around the world and talking to any scientists that would meet with them, asking them a simple question, which was, can our blood be used to help connect us to our grandchildren? And as Brad mentioned, at this point, DNA testing was not available, and paternity testing had been available for quite a while, but grandpaternity testing without blood from the intermediary generation had never been done. And so in most cases, the Abuelas met with shrugs. Nobody really knew how this could possibly be done. And as the dictatorship unraveled in 1983, they finally connected with a scientist who thought, oh yeah, I can do that. And that scientist was an American. Her name might be familiar to some of you. Her name is Dr. Mary Claire King. And she was already quite well known in the field of genetics, but she would later become world famous because she was the person who found the BRCA1 gene, the breast cancer gene. And Dr. King had actually worked in Chile during the dictatorship. And so she had personal experience of the horrors that a dictatorship can bring on a country. Also, her daughter was the exact same age as the grandchildren that the Abuelas were seeking. And she had been a dedicated advocate for human rights. She was very involved in the anti-Vietnam War movement as a graduate student at Berkeley. And so this project was just very appealing to her. And immediately she said, this is something that I want to work on. And working together with the Abuelas, they were able to develop the first ever grandpaternity test before, once again, before DNA testing was available. And Dr. King herself actually says that this represented the creation of genetic genealogy, which is a tool that is now widespread. It's used a lot in law enforcement investigations. So it was what helped find the Golden State Killer just a couple of years ago, and also by family heritage companies. So Ancestry.com, that all traces back to the Abuelas.
Yeah, Mary Claire King turns out to be one of the great heroes of your book, because she really pursued this challenge for some years and perfecting the technology. One of your greatest challenges in writing the book, as you say somewhere in a note about the process of putting it together, was deciding on where to focus. And as you say, you structure the narrative in the end around one particular family, although you do touch on quite a few cases. I mean, all in all, there were an estimated 500 grandchildren that were stolen by the dictatorship between 1976 and 1983. And you were telling me that up to now 140, right? The 140th was just recently located. But why did you decide to center around one particular family, and why the Roisinblit's family?
Yeah, so all of the Abuelas are absolutely incredible, and I could have written a book about any of them. And it was a decision that, on one hand, I grappled with because the Abuelas have talked about at length how they derived their power from working together. Their movement is very much about collective action. And so focusing more on one family rather than another, on some level, felt incongruent. But it felt very important to me also because it is hard. Once again, I talked about how hard it is for me, even having been immersed in this material for a really long time, to wrap my head around some of the brutality of the dictatorship. It is also hard to wrap your head around 500 individual stories, especially when they involve a lot of trauma. And so
we should say that's 500 disappeared children out of, I mean, there were, some estimates are 30,000 total people who fell victim to the junta, right?
Right. And so focusing on one family felt important to me because family is one of the only universal denominators that unites us all. Whether you have a great relationship with your family or none at all, we all derived from a family. And so I felt that even though the events described in this book are, thank God, unrelatable for most of us, that by following one family, it will allow readers to more immerse in the story and understand the historical events as they unfolded, more so than if I tried to tell all of the stories all at once.
Well, it really is. I mean, their story is very compelling. And the grandchild that Rosa was looking for was eventually found. But his story is actually representative of what a number of those whose identities were revealed encountered, which was, finding out who they were in many cases turned out to be far from the end of the story, right? Because dealing with the consequences of being told, hey, these aren't your real parents. Your parents were actually kidnapped and killed by the junta. It was just very obviously difficult for a number to process, and in some cases they resisted knowing their true identities or associating afterwards with the Abuelas. And that was true for a while, right, with the case of Rosa's grandchild, Guillermo. Talk about Guillermo.
Yeah, I should have added to your previous question about why I focused on one family. The other factor was just that this one particular family that is the focus of the book, the Roisinblit family, is such a compelling family. Rosa is such a compelling person. As I mentioned, she was a woman before her time, an obstetrician at a time when that was very, very rare for women in Argentina. And she also, just on a personal level, I had the honor of meeting her, and she is a spitfire. I met her when she was 102, and she was cracking jokes and kind of gossiping with me about various things. And she also, as a central subject in a book about the quest for truth in the form of finding the true grandchildren and connecting them with their true identities, she's a wonderful person to focus on because she has no filter and is just categorically honest. She can't be any other way. So in one of our meetings, she mentioned the word truth 22 times and said something along the lines of, I can only tell the truth. If I'm going to say something, I'm going to tell you the truth. And sometimes this was in the context of cracking jokes. Like she pointed at someone in a photo and pointed out that they had glasses on, but they didn't really need glasses. They just thought that they looked good with glasses, but they weren't for their eyes. They were just because they thought they looked pretty. So she was amazing. And I was very lucky to spend a lot of time with her grandson, whom she did eventually find after 21 years of desperate searching, Guillermo. And I guess to just put the different stages of revelations of the Abuelas in a little bit of context, the Abuelas always imagined that finding their grandchildren would be the most difficult part, and it was incredibly difficult. But once they started finding grandchildren, which they did even during the dictatorship, they realized that getting them back was going to prove just as difficult, because in many cases, these children were in the hands of military and police families who did not want to let them go. And very vicious custody battles ensued, and that was where Mary Claire King's grand paternity test was so vital, because it provided them with ammo to convince courts to return those children to them. Then they entered a different phase, which was when those grandchildren became legal adults at 18. And there were no more custody battles, but as Brad alluded to, some of those grandchildren were very resistant to learning their true identities. They had been raised in many cases in conservative families that were involved in the dictatorship and had been raised with a certain ideology, and had been raised in many cases to revile the madres and the abuelas. And they wanted nothing to do with their true identities and their true families. And the abuelas had to very slowly and carefully work to convince them to take blood tests if they suspected that they might be one of their stolen grandchildren. And Guillermo, Rosa's grandson, was ultimately located when he was 21 years old, thanks to an anonymous tip. So Rosa's search, and I hope you still read the book to find out more about what her search looked like, but she got a few clues early on, right during the dictatorship and after the dictatorship, and then the trail really went dark for decades, and she had no news of what had happened to her grandchild. She knew by then that she was looking for a boy. She knew that he had been named Rodolfo, and she knew that he had been born in one of the main clandestine detention centers in Buenos Aires. But beyond that, she knew nothing. And in the year 2000, someone called the Abuelas headquarters, and this is how the Abuelas have located many of their grandchildren, sharing suspicions about someone that they thought might be the child of desaparecidos. And in this case, their suspicions took the form of, I know this person, his name is Guillermo, he looks nothing like his family. He's tall, they're short, he's fair-skinned, they're dark-skinned, he has light hair, they have dark hair, on and on and on. And also that at one point, Guillermo's, the person who had raised him, the person he had always believed was his father, had intimated at one point that he was involved in the dictatorship, and that he was aware that Guillermo was not his true biological son, and that he had been indeed the child of desaparecidos. So someone called in these suspicions, and generally the Abuelas took a very slow and careful approach to potential grandchildren. They didn't want to scare them or overwhelm them, but the person on the other end of the line taking that anonymous tip happened to be Guillermo's biological sister. And she, who had not been taken by the military, she was a 15-month-old baby at the time, and in a rare show of mercy for some reason that she doesn't know, and I don't think anyone knows, she was returned to her biological family. So she had gone on to help the Abuelas, and she was on the other end of the line when this anonymous tip came in. And so she was 22 and, very impulsive and could not contain herself. She just wanted to go look and see if this person looked like her. She didn't plan to talk to him. She didn't plan to tell him anything about the Abuelas. So she goes to his place of work, which had been, the address had been given to her in this tip, and she doesn't see anyone that looks like the description in the anonymous tip. So she goes around and asks, hey, is there a Guillermo who works here? And one of the people working in the restaurant says, hey, Guillermo, come over here. Someone's looking for you. And so suddenly she's face to face with her potential brother. And that was.
Yeah, that's one of the most dramatic episodes in the book. Um, I just have a couple more questions, and then we're going to invite all of you to step up to the microphone there to ask a question. Let's talk for a minute about how Argentina now has dealt with the violence and trauma of its past. It's been more than 40 years since the junta gave up power, and Raul Alfonsín was elected president in 1983, and democracy was restored. He first moved pretty aggressively, put the military leaders on trial. Then he pulled back when there was pushback from the right, and prohibited more legal proceedings against the military. For crimes that they had committed, and shielded lower-ranking military officials from punishment. And subsequent elected leaders of Argentina have gone back and forth and back and forth. So where do things stand right now in Argentina in terms of, striking this balance between justice and peace?
These are very live issues in Argentina to today. So just as the Abuelas movement continues and they continue to find grandchildren, these issues continue to be debated in the present. And as Brad mentioned, at the beginning, just following the dictatorship, there was a huge push to bring justice to the perpetrators of these dictatorship-era crimes, and then a massive resistance from the military itself, which had been defanged, but not enough to make it completely unthreatening. And I think Brad actually covered some of these uprisings, but there were sects of the military that stood up and said, we are going to stage another coup if you don't stop this. And so Raul Alfonsín was forced to back off. And the president who followed him went one step further and pardoned all of the military officers who had been convicted during the dictatorship, and gave them complete immunity, and they lived free lives with their families walking down the street. And that immunity continued until 2005. And it was in large part thanks to the lobbying of the Abuelas and Madres that ultimately those laws were deemed unconstitutional. It was thanks to their lobbying. But Argentina has really swung between these dual impulses to bring justice to the perpetrators and to sweep what happened during that period under the rug. And currently, it is in a period where the president, Javier Milei, is trying to sweep things under the rug and has a very revisionist story about what happened during the dictatorship, and prosecuting these crimes is not a priority of his. It continues to be a priority of the Abuelas, and some of these trials are ongoing. But currently, there's someone in office that has clashed constantly with human rights groups, including with the Abuelas. He has tried to essentially gut the government and cut costs massively. And as part of that, lots of institutions that work with the Abuelas have been affected, and their work has been affected.
Well, let's end by talking a little bit about the United States today. While we are still a democracy, there are stories every day of the government, here seizing immigrants and sequestering them in detention centers or expelling them. I mean, we haven't read about bodies being dropped in rivers, but are there lessons in the experience of Argentina and the Abuelas that are relevant to what's happening here today?
Yeah, thank you for that question. As you said, thankfully, we remain very far from Argentina during the dictatorship period between 1976 and 1983. We're talking about a regime that stole babies and killed their mothers who had just given birth. But I do think that there are powerful lessons in Argentina's history and encompassed in the book. And I think the main one that feels the most resonant today is Argentina is a stark cautionary tale about what can happen when a government puts its agenda before due process and before the law. And the Abuelas offer a rejoinder to that, and they have showed how working together, ordinary citizens can stand up and resist in the case that things get very extreme. So I think that there are lessons about the dark part of this history, from the dark part of this history, and also from the Abuelas themselves that are more inspirational, I hope.
Okay. If anybody has a question, come to the microphone. I'm just going to squeeze in one more question that I just remembered. Because at the end of your book, there are lots of notes. I mean, this is a very well documented book. How many notes are there? And I mean, I know you take particular pride in having such an extensive appendix there of endnotes, right?
Yes, I fed Brad this question. He asked if there was anything that I was excited to talk about, and I said endnotes, which is a really odd answer, but there are almost 100 pages of endnotes, and I'm very proud of them because even though the events in this book are hard to believe, this is a true story. And because it is so hard to believe, it felt very important for me to verify and document every single fact and statement that is represented in the pages here. And everything has been fact checked both by me, and I was really lucky to work with several outside fact checkers. So I actually initially had 3,500 endnotes, and that would have been 170 pages of endnotes, and that was too much. So they've been shaved down. But thank you for allowing me to talk about my endnotes because I am very proud of them.
Okay, thank you. Really interesting story. I guess I have a small package of questions that hang together, I think. So, oh, actually, one of them is simple. Brad suggested most of us have some recollection of the term "the disappeared," and I certainly do. But I don't remember exactly when I became aware of the term and the whole concept. Presumably in the 1980s, but how far into the 80s, or was it? Do you have any way of sort of measuring how widely known the term was and sort of the story here in this country?
Yeah, that's a great question. That I know of, the first mention of the disappeared, the desaparecidos, in the Argentine context happened in 1977 in a Time article, and that has been documented. So it was actually first introduced to American audiences quite early in the dictatorship. And I do think by the 80s, it was quite widespread in the way that the U.S. media covered Argentina.
The other question I'll grab here quickly. I'm just wondering how the abuelas, grandmothers, compared were they targeted? To what extent were they targeted? To what extent in comparison to other demonstrators or other folks that the regime feared? See, the grandmothers would carry some impact, you would assume, on the rest of the population. But on the other hand, they were very visible, with these white diapers on their head and so forth. And so, whereas other demonstrators and other undesirables in the minds of the regime might have been more easier to. So I don't know if this has any resonance for today, but it is based on that. Is it a good idea to be very visible in the demonstration and have, when it comes to, so were they more targeted than others? Not at all targeted, or?
Yeah, well, it's a great question. It allows me to talk about something that I didn't get a chance to earlier. But the Abuelas led this dual existence where at 3:30 p.m. on Thursdays, they were extremely visible. They had their white diapers on and then handkerchiefs, and they were right in front of the presidential palace screaming for answers. Incredibly visible, and they wanted to attract attention. The Plaza and their togetherness in the Plaza provided them a certain shield.
Right.
The international press started paying attention to them, and if the military came and grabbed them from the Plaza, that was going to make huge international ripples. And so they were quite safe and protected by their togetherness and by their notoriety when they were in the Plaza. During other times of the week, they had to be incredibly careful. And their kind of cultural camouflage as grandmothers really helped in this respect. They were mostly in their 50s and 60s, and they dressed very neatly. And for the most part, they could really slip under the radar. So they would meet in cafes at the beginning of their organization before they had a headquarters, and they would bring knitting needles and lay them on the table, or they would bring empty packages that were tied up with ribbon so it looked like they were celebrating a birthday, and they would sing happy birthday to each other, but then when the waiter walked away, they would sign documents that they needed to sign under the table. In one case, they actually even brought back sensitive documents from another country by buying chocolates, eating the chocolates out of the wrappers, and then crumpling up their notes and putting it in the wrappers and bringing that through security, because who was going to suspect little grandmas with a box of chocolates? Nobody. They were waved right through the military checkpoint. So they were very careful, and thankfully that meant that none of the Abuelas were disappeared by the military, but they were threatened and they were harassed. And so they received constant bomb threats and death threats to their headquarters once they had one. And in certain cases, they were attacked in the Plaza de Mayo by people who viewed them as anti-patriotic. Right. So they were pushed to the ground and punched, but thankfully never disappeared. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Great answers.
Hi, I was in that area at the time. I was in Argentina in 1975. I saw the Ford Falcons, and I've been writing a lot about it. And the story that you're telling is such a wrenching human rights story. And choosing the children who were kidnapped and the story of their mother's search it's a wonderful way to get people to read about this period, because you're really talking about a kind of political genocide in the period. So I applaud that. It's fantastic that you've done it in a way that is so approachable. But there is a dimension to this story I wanted to bring up that you hadn't mentioned, and that's well, two. One is the politics. I've been in Latin America my whole life, and I don't understand Argentine politics. Maybe, Brad, you do. Argentine politics.
Yeah, but I'm going to keep it to myself.
It's a special creature. But I'd like you to talk about the politics. What is the political legacy of these children when they look back on their parents? What were their parents doing? I kind of understand that most of the madres, I don't know about the abuelas, were associated with the Montoneros, which would be the left-wing part of the Peronist movement. Do the abuelas talk to their children about the political legacy, why their parents were killed, why they were wrapped up? And then the other question is about fact and accuracy, and I mean, there's no other way to talk about it. There is misinformation in this thing. For example, the figure 30,000. Most of us who do human rights research, we know that there's only a factual basis for 9,000, and yet the abuelas insist you have to say it's 30,000. They put up a plaque. So how do you deal with those questions, and particularly about the politics and what they tell their children?
Yeah, those are great questions. So on the first question, I want to talk about these really incredible documents that the Abuelas put together, which are called biographical family archives. And when a grandchild is found, they're presented with a very thick document. It can be up to 400 pages. And this is a document that is a compendium of interviews that the Abuelas as an organization has done with people that knew the recovered grandchild's disappeared parents. And the idea is that they can really get to know their disappeared parents beyond the grim details that might be in government records about how they disappeared. And I was very lucky. Guillermo, one of the main subjects in this book, shared his biographical family archive with me. And it had really wonderful details about who his parents were as people, what kind of pets they had growing up, what they liked to eat, what they liked to cook, how they would play pranks on their cousins. And it also talked a lot about their activism and their involvement in the Montoneros and how they got involved and why they got involved and what their involvement looked like at the time that they disappeared.
The Montoneros were, you should...
Yeah, so the Montoneros were a left-wing revolutionary group that sprung up in the early 1970s in reaction to autocratic governments and in resistance to autocratic governments that existed. And their methods over time evolved to be, they used violence. So they would, and they were, at least at the beginning, quite careful in their use of violence. It was more violent propaganda, but they would bomb the golf clubs of the elite, but first they would put out a sign that said, "Caution, dynamited zone," so that people, would know what was coming. And over time, as we got closer and closer to the coup, the struggle between those types of revolutionary groups and the right became much more intense, and the violence kind of seeped outwards and was not necessarily always so targeted. And to fund their movement, they did kidnap business executives and foreign diplomats and things like that. And the Abuelas are very clear-eyed about this. They've discussed this in the family archives. They discuss it in the type of materials that they put out. But their perspective is that even if their children were involved in some sort of revolutionary movement, although I should say many of the people who were involved in revolutionary movements were not involved in violence. They were involved in spreading flyers and things of this nature. But even if they were involved in more of the violent actions, they should not have been disappeared. They should have been arrested and subjected to a fair trial. And so it is not, justification for what happened, but they are open about it.
Well, not only that, in the case of the Rosenblits, Rosa's daughter, Patricia, and her son-in-law, Jose, they weren't disappeared until a couple of years into the repression. They had gone quiet. They had thought they were safe, had begun to resurface and start what they hoped would be a non-political life, and then suddenly, members of the regime showed up and disappeared them.
Absolutely, they had begun to step back from those types of activities, and in fact, the Montoneros had been, and all of the leftist revolutionary movements had been crushed by the military by that time, and Patricia had wanted to go back to medical school to study to be a doctor. Jose had opened a toy store, and it was at that point when they had, by all accounts, very little involvement in any sort of political activities that they were taken. And on the second question about numbers, like so much during that period, because this was the military's intent, there's a lot that's blurry. I think human rights groups say that up to 30,000 people disappeared, but the number that you mentioned, 9,000, is the number that they have actual recorded names for. And the Abuelas suggest that there might be quite a large gap because there are lots of people who didn't come forward out of fear to report that a family member was disappeared, and those names continue to come out.
My sister was a strong supporter of the efforts to close the School of the Americas. Were there graduates involved in these matters at all? And is that institution going to be revived?
So the School of the Americas was a school that was run by the U.S. military in Panama until 1984, and it trained soldiers in how to fight communism in Latin America. And the playbook, the manual of the school was, I think it was, this story was broken by the Washington Post. I don't know if it was you or someone else, but they found the manual of the school and it endorsed the use of quite extreme methods in the service of counterintelligence. So torture, truth serum, and this was all written down in documents about the school's methods, and this was being trained. These methods were being passed along to Latin American soldiers. And Viola, Roberto Viola, who was the president to follow Jorge Rafael Videla, the first president during the dictatorship period, was a graduate of the School of the Americas. So there was a connection there, and he had presumably absorbed that ideology.
Okay, 2 more questions.
So I was a junior Foreign Service officer at the U.S. Embassy in Buenos Aires from 1976 to 79, and I was the human rights officer, the first one. This was Carter was elected in 76, established human rights as more of a basis for U.S. foreign policy, dealing with the whole history of dilemmas. I'd like to say that your presentation is very accurate from my experience on the ground there. I would say we certainly knew about what was going on early. I was with the Mothers of the Plaza de Mayo in 1976, 1977. We became much more active, I would say, later. But we were interviewing families of the disappeared for some time. And then later, a lot more happened, again, with the U.S. government and the new administration. But does your book actually discuss, or did you look into the role of any international, you talked about the international press as giving attention, putting a spotlight on these atrocities. But did you look at any other things of what either the U.S. government or other governments did to try to ameliorate or confront what was going on there? And what do I wonder what the grandmothers think of the United States, either then or now?
Yeah, great questions. It's amazing. We have a lot of people who have personal experience in Argentina, which is a lot of fun. We should all powwow.
That's the great thing about a P&P audience.
Yes.
You've got people who've been there and done that,
Yes.
whatever the subject.
Absolutely. So you must have been there at the same time as Tex Harris, who. Okay. Okay. I got to meet Tex, and he was an amazing man. Yes. So I talked about Kissinger and what the cables revealed about Kissinger and what he shared with the Argentine military. But in 1977, Jimmy Carter was elected president in the U.S., and the relationship and American approach to the Argentine dictatorship changed immensely. And of course, Jimmy Carter had campaigned on a platform of promoting human rights globally. And there are several scenes in the book that recount visits by Terrence Todman, for example, and then Cyrus Vance to Argentina, and how the Madres and Abuelas tried to use those visits to seek help from the United States and also to attract international media to cover their interactions with those diplomats. And so that's sort of the lens through which that shift is covered in the book.
So I was involved mostly with Chile, but also Argentina and Uruguay in the human rights movement in the 70s here and on. But now I've switched to becoming a filmmaker. I just want to mention to people, one of my top 10 films is Official Story, which is the most amazing.
It's amazing.
When she puts the door on his hand.
Yeah.
And recently there's the Penguin Lessons. Did you see that?
I haven't, so my mom is here, and our plan is to go home and watch it tonight.
Yes, because that brings up. But I just was hoping maybe you could, because my mind can't remember any of the. I know there's 1 or 2 documentaries on it. Or do you think there's any plan to make a film from what you're talking about, this story?
There's some great documentaries about the Abuelas. I'm going to struggle to remember them.
The Women of
the
the
exact
Plaza?
title. The University of North Carolina made a really good documentary. I think it's just called Searching for the Disappeared, if I'm not mistaken. There's also a very interesting documentary about Robert Cox, who was the editor of the Buenos Aires Herald during this time. And the Buenos Aires Herald was a newspaper based in Argentina, but it was in English. And most of its reporters were foreigners, and that provided them a measure of protection. And so that was the Argentine paper that is credited with being the first to openly write about these stories. And I think that that documentary is called Messenger on a White Horse, if
But
I'm not
wasn't there
mistaken.
also Women of the Plaza?
There are lots of
Yeah.
documentaries about the Madres as well, but I'm not going to remember the exact titles. Argentina 1985 is also another feature film that came out in the past couple of years, and it was excellent and very briefly talks about the story of the Abuelas and the Madres, but it's just a really good.
And just one other quick question. There's a young California woman who was caught up in this, and we struggled to get her released. She did get released. Do you deal with, I can't remember her name at all. No?
Was it
She had a La-
Deutsch?
No, she had a Latin last name. She was American. Okay.
That is not covered in the book, but if you remember the name, let me know, because
Yeah.
I might.
Yeah, well, I mean, Haley, there are these documentaries and films now, but as you recount in your own history about how you came to this story back in 2011 when you first went to Argentina and heard about the Abuelas, in looking for books about them, you only found one in English. And so now here you are, 14 years later, you've written a very important and a very moving book in English about what happened, very well documented. I mean, it's a book on multiple levels. It's a compelling family saga. It's a fascinating forensic detective story, and it's a triumphant, precedent-setting human rights tale featuring some of the most determined and heroic grandmothers that we'll ever read about. So I encourage all of you to get Haley's book, A Flower Traveled in My Blood, and thank you so much, Haley, for coming tonight.
Thank you for having me, and thank you to all of you for being here. It means a lot.